I think there's a truth that we all accept, whether we like it or not, that one day this life will end. At some point, we won't be part of this life anymore. Now, as uplifting as that idea is, there's an interesting thought in that, is that at some point, your life story, my life story, will just be a story one day. And so the question is that, what will your story be when your life is just that? Your life is just a story. And ultimately, that's up to you, right? It's up to me, right? Whether we realize it or not, our lives write a story. And I think it's something that's so easy to lose track of, that we get so caught up in what we're doing each and every day that we forget that our lives will ultimately build a story, will come together as a story. And so what is it that actually influences the story that I will write with my life? Well, what is it that influences what you will write with your life? Because I think there's this kind of mistaken idea that the life story that we produce will be dictated by the big events in our life. There's big things that happen. That's what everyone will remember me by. So I'm just looking for those big moments to do big things that will stand out and be seen. But I think the evidence shows us that's not actually the case. The thing that ultimately dictates our life, the thing that ultimately decides the story our lives will write, are the small choices, the little things we do each day, the habits that recur throughout our lives. That's the thing that really, really influences the story that we will write. And if we step back and we think about it, that's fairly easy to see. I mean, again, let's look at a sporting event. When a baseball player walks up to bat and he hits a home run, or a football player reaches out, makes this incredible catch, stretches out and lands in the end zone and gets a touchdown. Right? They're the events that we celebrate. Right? That home run, that touchdown. But did that home run or that touchdown happen by the athlete just kind of showing up at the game that day? No, it happened because what the athlete did day after day, showing up to practice, getting ready, following disciplines in their lives. And not just day after day, but week after week, year after year. And so ultimately, it was their daily pattern that led them to those moments that we celebrate. And the reality is that most of our lives follow a pretty regular pattern. You wake up and say it's a Tuesday. You go, well, Tuesdays, this was what time I get up. This is what I go and do on Tuesday. On Wednesday, this is what time I get up. This is what I go and do on Wednesdays. So your life is following a pattern. Here's the question. Is it a pattern that you've chosen? Basically saying that these are the things I want to do, these are the things I want to achieve, and in order to do that, I'm going to follow this pattern? Or does it just kind of happen? You just got to wake up. What do I run into today? And I will just deal with whatever happens today. Which of those we follow will dictate in a huge way what story we write with our lives, because our lives are driven, our lives are created, the story of our lives come from the choices that we make. So today I want to continue our series, The Choices We Make. Right? And of course, what we're looking at here is how do our choices influence life? Last week, we looked at how our choices influence our impact on other people. Today, I want to look at the other side of it. Today, I want to look at the fact that our habits form us. So often we look at something, we say, hey, man, that's habit forming. But the bigger thing to consider is, what do our habits do in our lives? What are the habits that we follow? Because that's what forms us. That's what dictates our story. Those small choices that we make each and every day. Because the story that you will write with your life, no matter what stage of life you're in, is ultimately the sum total of the choices you have made in the time that you have had. So what are your choices writing in your life? What are my choices writing in my life? So as we go through this, we want to continue looking at the story of Samson's life. That's what we kicked off last week. As we saw, Samson's life was a pretty bumpy story, we'll say. Right? Because we know that Samson was called to do great things. Remember, Samson was considered what's called a judge. In the Old Testament, a judge was someone who was a defender of their people. They were called to lead their people in some way, right? Not as a political leader, not as a king, but as someone who drew them together. And Samson was responsible to defend his people against an occupier, the Philistines. The Philistines had somehow come in, conquered Samson's people years earlier, and ruled over them. And Samson was actually called to lead his people to freedom. That's what he was supposed to be doing with his life. But Samson was a pretty impulsive guy. Right? Samson had this real tendency to make super questionable decisions. In fact, we spent last week entirely on just one really bad decision that he made. You remember what that decision was? He's supposed to be defending his people against the Philistines. What does he do? He decides he wants to marry a Philistine woman. But as we talked about, this wasn't a Romeo and Juliet sort of thing. This was a, whoa, she's hot. I want to marry her. And so he made that entire decision to marry her. As we found out, he didn't even know her. He had just seen her and was so attracted to her, he had to have her. And that decision led to a huge mess. So many people were harmed, right? That property was destroyed, property was stolen, fights are breaking out. Ultimately, the girl and her father lose their lives. And why did he make that decision? Because he followed the Samson decision-making process. Remember what it was? Ooh, I want it. Whoa, but wow, is this really a good idea? No, don't worry about it. I deserve it. I work so hard, I deserve it. Yeah, but this is really dangerous. I can handle it. What could go wrong? Right? He basically had no regard for anyone else. His decision-making was always about what I want. And that's what he did. As far as we can tell, what dictated his life story were the choices he made entirely based on impulse, entirely based on what I want. Now, following what we looked at last week, Samson had more go-arounds with the Philistines. They kind of went back and forth in various battles. At one point, Samson almost gets captured, but at the last minute, he breaks free, arises victorious. And as Samson, in this one particular incident where he almost doesn't get away with it, rather than say, whoa, that was a terrible idea, I shouldn't do that anymore, he goes, I came out on top. I am awesome. And he feels totally justified with his self-centered behavior. In fact, if we were to actually take Samson's entire story, it's 4 chapters in the book of Judges, you take his entire story, you could break it down and identify it with one word: reckless. Reckless. As far as we can tell, throughout his entire life, all of his choices were reckless choices, self-centered about what he wanted. So what's he going to do this week? What's he going to show us this week? Well, as we meet up with Samson this week, he's taking a walk, a long walk. He's heading to a city named Gaza. The city of Gaza was a Philistine city. And it's like 34 miles from where he lives. A 34-mile walk. Now, to put that in context, the average person requires more than 2,000 steps to walk a mile. He took 70,000 steps towards this city of Gaza. Every step, a step closer to something really dangerous. He must be doing this for a really good reason. Yeah, there's this Philistine woman there that he doesn't know. And he decides he wants to spend the night with her. So he walks into this Philistine stronghold, goes in to spend the night with her. But now here's the thing. Because of all the trouble that Samson has stirred up over time, the Philistines know who he is, and they hate him. So he does not slip into town unnoticed. And they know where he's at and what he's doing. And they're like, finally, this is our opportunity. We are going to get him this time. So the Philistines all pull together, decide that the right time to attack is at dawn, just as light breaks, they can come in, they can get him. What's Samson going to do? He's going to be caught with his pants down, right? Come on, that's a little funny, right? Come on, that's a little funny. It's church, you're allowed to laugh. Come on, come on. You're allowed to laugh here, really. So what's he going to do? All right, well, we're told that Samson lay there only until the middle of the night. Okay, bad idea to go there in the first place, but a good plan is to maybe slip out a little bit early, right? That he's a seasoned warrior. He knows what good warriors would do. He himself would wait for dawn to attack. So let me get myself out of here. I'll just quietly escape during the night. Except he doesn't do it quietly. Goes on to tell us that he got up, took hold of the doors of the city gate, together with 2 posts, and tore them loose, bar and all. He lifted them to his shoulders and carried them to the top of the hill that faces Hebron. What's purpose does that serve? Its purpose is to show off. You guys almost had me, but I always win. As opposed to slipping out quietly, getting away with it, he's going to rub their face in it. He basically rips the door from the gate and doesn't just tear it down, but carries it off. See, you can't hurt me. You can't touch me. I always win. I can do whatever I want, and I will always come out on top. And he believes that. Why does he believe it? Because he has incredible abilities. And because of his incredible abilities, he never worries about what's going to happen to him. And the thing that's kind of sad in all this is that he has incredible gifts, incredible abilities, and he could have written an amazing story with his life. He could have written a story about how he developed those abilities, how he got better at it, how he learned to become a leader. His story could have been leading his people to freedom. He had the opportunity for so much achievement. But instead of using his abilities to make a difference, he rests on his abilities. He recognizes that because he is naturally so good, he doesn't really have to try. He could have done so much, but he did so little because he could. Because he just rested on what he already had. And he makes these dangerous choices all the time because his abilities allow him to do that. Because he's convinced that he has always won, he has always won, and he always will win. Or so he thinks. Because one day, he makes a decision that will be his undoing. The decision that will eventually take him down. And on the day he makes that decision, he probably wishes he would have listened to music by Tom Jones. My, Delilah. If you know the song Delilah, it's a story of a man who was harmed by a woman named Delilah. And it's clearly all her fault, by the way. Right? But Samson falls for Delilah, is the issue. What the narrative tells us is, sometime later, he fell in love with a woman in the valley of Sorek, whose name was Delilah. Now, the valley of Sorek, the metaphor is kind of crazy, how kind of perfect it is. The valley of Sorek is this valley that's right on the edge of the Philistine-controlled territories. So on one side of the valley is where Samson's people live. On the other side of the valley is the Philistines' primary territory. And so Samson, as opposed to staying away from that place, decides to go visit that place. And when he gets there, he sees Delilah. Now, we actually know very, very little about Delilah. The assumption is always made that she is a Philistine. We're not actually told that. But she's in this area in the valley near the Philistines. And although we don't know much about Delilah, we know a lot about Samson. First of all, it says he fell in love. If you've been here for both weeks, what does fell in love mean to Samson? She was hot. That's right, she was hot. He was attracted to her. It was physical attraction. This one may be raised to the level of infatuation. And we know he makes bad choices, but he's convinced he's invincible. He's convinced that because he's so good, that he can take these chances all the time and nothing ever is going to happen because He's Samson. I can handle it. What could go wrong? But now, Samson sees this as an opportunity to have a good time again, but the Philistines see this as finally their chance. It says, the rulers of the Philistines went to Delilah and said, see if you can lure Samson into showing you the secret of his great strength and how we can overpower him so we may tie him up and subdue him. Each one of us will give you 1,100 shekels of silver. Now, 1,100 pieces of silver sounds like a lot of money. But it's interesting. And notice it says that each one of us, there were actually 5 rulers of the Philistines. So she here can earn 5,500 pieces of silver. And all she has to do is let Samson be Samson. Figure out the way to subdue him, and they will pay her. But this is love, right? I mean, think of the person in the world you love the very most. Is there any amount of money that you would sell them out for? But remember, we're told that Samson fell in love. Nowhere does it say that Delilah fell in love. In fact, it appears that Delilah has no problem with this arrangement because she gets to work right away. She starts asking him, hey, you've got a secret. Tell me what your secret is. Does that sound familiar? Remember the wedding last week? Hey, Samson, you got a secret. Tell me what the secret is. And that's where the whole mess kicked off. So Samson's got to know what she's up to. He's got to know this is suspicious. But hey, he's Samson. I can handle it. He kind of decides to toy with her a bit. He kind of lies to her. Like, he doesn't kind of lie to her. He lies to her. And he tells her ways that he can be bound up so he can't break free. And he makes up this kind of ridiculous thing of, okay, there've got to be these special kind of strings, and they've got to be exactly 7 of them. And if you do that, I will never be able to break free. So a little later, he falls asleep, and he awakens. The Philistines rushing in towards him, bound up exactly as he described. But of course, it was a lie. He breaks free, defeats those Philistines, drives them out. So now, he's got to know Delilah is working against him. I mean, he had to be pretty sure before, but he certainly knows now. He must be going to leave now. I'm Samson. I can handle it. And so this scenario repeats a bunch of times. And each time he tells her some lie that he's made up about how he can be bound. He falls asleep, wakes up the Philistines, bound exactly as he described, and he breaks free and drives them out each time. But here's the thing. Each time he does it, the lie gets a little bit closer to the truth. He keeps dancing closer and closer to the edge of destruction. And I think it demonstrates something that we want to be on guard for. Samson's life was lived on the edge of destruction constantly, but he always came out okay. But rather than learn from it, rather than say, whoa, that was a really dangerous decision, I shouldn't do that anymore, it became, oh man, I could do that. In fact, I can go a little further next time because I'm still going to be fine. And although it's very easy to judge Samson for those choices, how often do we make choices that put us closer and closer to destruction? You know, and that can come in a lot of different forms. You know, it's maybe someone in your life that you're close to, maybe a family member, spouse, a child, a parent, a sibling, and you kind of talk to them really harshly because you lost your temper and you said a bunch of terrible things. But they didn't leave. So the first time you feel a bit bad about it. But the next time you lose your temper and you do the same thing again, you don't feel quite as bad about it. They didn't leave though, so it's okay. And then suddenly you start to justify it. Oh, you know, they just know, I don't really mean those things. They know me better than that. Because we're convinced that it's okay, but then someday they close you out of their life because they don't want to deal with that anymore. Or what about situations where A particular month comes along, we make a really bad financial choice to spend some money we don't necessarily have. And towards the end of the month arrives, and we're just eking it out. And we almost don't make it. But we do make it. Oh, you know what? That wasn't so bad. People do that sort of thing all the time. And we continue to justify dangerous financial choices. Or one that's easy to make, and I don't mean any condemnation by any of these things. But, we go out, we grab a couple drinks, we drive home, and then we realize that, wow, I was a little foggier than I realized. But, I made it, so it's okay. And it starts to become the norm, and we do it anyway, all the time. I think the thing that we have to be on guard for is that when we make a dangerous choice, when we start to dance on the edge of life, when we come out okay, we got to be careful that coming out okay doesn't mean we came out all right. It means we were fortunate that we came through this time. And we want to try to learn from that rather than convince ourselves that we're always going to be fine and keep dancing closer and closer to the edge of destruction, believing we'll always be fine until one day we're not. And that can happen to any of us. And eventually, that happens to Samson. Because as Samson is playing this game with Delilah, getting closer and closer to the truth, she turns up the heat a little bit. And instead of just asking, she says, you tell me you love me so much, yet you lie to me. What kind of love is that, lying to me? And so she finally guilts him into telling her the truth. So Samson told her everything. He said, "No razor has ever been used on my head, because I've been a Nazirite dedicated to God from my mother's womb. If my head were shaved, my strength would leave me. I would become as weak as any other man." So he tells her this. This is the source of his strength. He falls asleep. In fact, it's funny, he actually falls asleep in her lap, we're told. And then his hair is cut off, and the Philistines come bursting in. And we're actually told that Samson says to himself, "I will prevail again this time as I always have before." Except this time he doesn't prevail. This time he is unable to defeat the Philistines. Instead, he is beaten, he is blinded, he is shackled, and he's imprisoned. Now, looking at that, does it seem that his strength was actually in his hair? Does it seem like a magic thing like that was actually going on? So, if his strength wasn't actually in his hair, what was happening? Well, I think what it was that it's about what the hair represented. Because notice it says that he is a Nazirite. Okay, a Nazirite was a vow that someone took. It was a commitment to God. Someone would actually make a commitment to God to do something. What Samson had committed to do was to defend his people, to try to lead them to freedom. Now, why is his hair important? Because under the Nazirite vow, you would stop cutting your hair. And the idea was that your hair being long was an outward symbol of an inward commitment that you had made. An outward symbol of the fact that I am dedicated to do something and to achieve something. And so having his hair cut off was simply a physical representation of the choices he had already made. Right? He had made that commitment to try to defend his people, to lead them to freedom, to use his abilities to make a difference in other people's lives. But instead, what did he do? He used those gifts to lazily live his life, to enable his own bad behavior, to rather than use his gifts and abilities to do the good that he could do, he used those gifts and abilities to empower his misbehavior. And I think God just accepted his choice to do that. I think what went down here is really well captured by something that C.S. Lewis wrote from a book of his that I absolutely love called The Great Divorce. And in that book, there's this statement. There are only two kinds of people in the end. Those who say to God, thy will be done. And those to whom God says, in the end, thy will be done. Basically, Samson had been making his own choices, and he had been avoiding the consequences of those choices for years. But in this moment, Samson made his choice, and God says, you've made your choice. I will allow you to do that. You make your choice, and you just walk out the consequences of it. I don't think this is God inflicting punishment at all. I think this is simply God accepting what Samson had chosen. That's your choice. You have free will. Make your choice. And for Samson, eventually, that choice caught up with him. Now, ultimately, Samson would die in prison, but he does have this great moment near the end of his life where he actually, while in prison, destroys a bunch of things and takes a bunch of Philistines out with him. But despite that victory, his life never lived up to what it could have been. He never made the kind of difference he could have made. And in fact, I think the tragedy of Samson's life is captured by the very last sentence of his narrative. It says, Samson had led Israel 20 years. So Samson had 20 years to write an amazing story. He was loaded up with gifts and abilities and opportunity. He could do things that no one else could do. He was agile, he was strong, he was clearly smart. Yet all that time, the story he wrote was not a story of victory. It was not a story of changed lives. It was not a story that moved anyone's else's life forward. It was a story of him resting on what he had and not using it to make a difference. The thing is that if you read through the entire narrative of Samson, although it includes a few victories in battle, every one of those victories are the outcome of him getting himself out of trouble. We have no record of him doing what he committed to do, defending his people, trying to change people's lives. In fact, we have record of him actually putting them constantly in danger. So despite all his gifts, all his abilities, 20 years of opportunity, what story did he write? He wrote a story of selfishness and recklessness. What we know for certain is the story that we have of him is certainly not the story that he would want remembered of him. So when I wake up and I make choices today that are writing my story, is it writing the story I want remembered about me? I mean, it's the same question that we are all facing each day. You have gifts and abilities. I have gifts and abilities. And we all have opportunities to do things with them. And how we use those things, that will be the story that we write. And we all have an opportunity to write a story that impacts lives in such a bright, positive way. But there is a constant temptation to look to those gifts and abilities as security, the things that empower us, or enable us, I should say, that enable us to do what we want to do without consideration for what we could actually do. But the good news is, it doesn't matter what stage of life you're in. Right? There is always time to write a good story with your life. There is always time to change the story of your life if it's not going the way you want. That each and every one of us, no matter where we are in life, can write an amazing story with our lives. And it comes down to our daily decisions. So, what story do you want to write with your life? You have everything you need to write an incredible, incredible, life-changing story. It just comes down to the choices that we make.